All right, welcome back everyone to the deep dive. Today we're gonna take a deep dive into a topic that I think is incredibly relevant and fascinating, and that is the world of shills and market manipulation.
hmm
We've got a pretty big stack of information here, a lot of sources that we're going to try and unpack for you today.
Yeah, it should be really interesting. We're going to try to cover what a shill is in the context of financial markets, also dive into why it became illegal. We've got some pretty interesting historical examples, both before and after the formation of the SEC. And then we're going to kind of come into modern times and look at some more modern examples of shilling.
And then really, like, I think what's so fascinating about this is that we're going to be looking specifically at tactics. Like how do shills actually operate?
Yeah.
And so I'm really excited about that part of our discussion today, and I think it's going to be really insightful for our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, understanding the tactics and methods that these individuals use is crucial to really being able to protect yourself and just to have a, deeper understanding of how these things work in the real world.
So let's start, basic definition here.
Yeah.
What is a shill? Like when we use that word, we talk about a shill. What are we actually talking about?
So I think the simplest way to define a shill is somebody that secretly promotes a person or an organization to make them seem more credible or popular than they actually are. And the real key here is the secretly part. They don't disclose that they have some sort of, financial interest or connection to what they're actually promoting. And you see this everywhere. It's not just, in the financial markets.
I was going to say, like,
Yeah.
we see this in everyday life.
Oh, yes.
It's like, I go on and I see a review for a restaurant, and it turns out, that the person who wrote the review is actually like best friends with the owner or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great example. And, our sources point out that you see this a lot in media, in marketing, even in politics, people trying to sway public opinion without revealing their true motives. But for our deep dive today, like you said, we're going to really hone in on the world of financial markets.
Okay, so in that context, when we're talking about stocks, investments, that kind of thing, what does a show? How do they operate? What does that look like?
So when we're talking about finance, a shill is typically trying to create this kind of artificial um, excitement or enthusiasm for a particular security. So, think like a stock, for example. And they'll often act like, this totally independent investor who's just like super excited about a company. And the hope is that they can get other people to jump on board and buy into that same stock.
So it's like it's creating a buzz, creating this FOMO,
Yeah.
this fear of missing out. Like
Yeah.
everybody's getting on this train. I need to get on this train too.
Exactly. Exactly. You might hear the terms plant or stooge used as well. It's really referring to the same thing. Someone secretly working with an organization, but they're trying to appear as though they're just a neutral observer, right? And one thing that's really interesting here is that this kind of shilling in the financial markets, it's often actually illegal.
Okay, so why is that? Like what's the big deal?
Yeah.
Why the legal crackdown?
Well, I mean, you think about it, right? Like if someone's able to artificially inflate the price of a stock by creating all this hype and excitement around it that's not really genuine, they can then sell off their own shares at this inflated price. And everybody else who bought in based on that false enthusiasm ends up holding the bag.
They lose. Yep.
They lose. And to kind of combat that widespread potential for fraud, back in 1933, they actually enacted the Securities Act of 1933, which was a huge piece of legislation designed to address these kinds of issues.
And we should say we're gonna refer to that as the 33 Act throughout this discussion.
Right, right.
So the 33 Act that was really foundational in terms of regulation. So what were the main goals of that act?
Yeah, so I think you can really boil it down to two primary objectives that this act had. The first was that it required companies that were issuing securities to the public um, to disclose a lot of important information, financial information about their securities, and this was all about transparency. This was the truth and securities principle. And then second, it was designed to prohibit, deceit, misrepresentations, and other fraudulent activities when it came to the sale of securities.
So it's really about the investors, right? It's about making sure the investors have the information that they need so they can make good decisions, informed decisions about their investments, as opposed to just being swayed by the hype, by the smoke and mirrors.
Exactly, exactly. The government wasn't guaranteeing that your investments were going to be successful, right? But they were trying to level the playing field, and make sure that everyone was operating with the same basic facts, and that nobody was being intentionally, um, lied to, misled.
So how did the 33 Act actually accomplish it? Like what were the mechanisms that it put in place to kind of to achieve those goals?
So one of the big ways that it did that was through mandatory registration. So under Section 5 of the Act, most securities that were being offered to the public had to be registered with the SEC, which is the Securities and Exchange Commission. They're the main regulatory body that oversees the financial markets in the U.S. And this registration process involves submitting a really detailed registration statement. And this statement under Section 6, it includes the prospectus. Think of this as like, the company's official sales brochure for their stock. It's packed with all this really important information, the financial details that potential investors need to see before they make a decision. And then under Section 7, the SEC actually has the power to say exactly what kind of information needs to be in these documents. They're not just kind of like winging it. There's specific requirements.
Companies can't just kind of, throw something together, put it out there, and start selling stock without, really explaining what's going on.
Exactly, exactly. And it goes, a step further. The SEC doesn't just collect these documents; they actually review them, and they make sure that they're meeting these disclosure requirements under Section 8. They can send these deficiency letters back to the company if something's missing or it's not clear. And then, this is where the accountability really comes in. Section 11 actually holds issuers strictly liable for any material misstatements or omissions in that registration statement or the prospectus.
And when you say strictly liable, I mean, for our listeners out there who, might not be familiar with kind of legalese, like what does that actually mean?
Yeah, so basically what it means is that unlike having to prove that a company intentionally, set out to mislead investors, strict liability means that if there were any significant inaccuracies or missing information in those key documents, in the registration statement or the prospectus, and then investors ended up losing money as a result of that, the company can be held responsible, even if they didn't deliberately lie. So investors who lost money because of that flawed disclosure, they can sue under this provision. And furthermore, Section 17A, that's a really broad anti-fraud provision that prohibits any kind of fraudulent activity in the sale of security. So, I mean, you can see, right, the whole framework of the Securities Act, it was designed to prevent this kind of market manipulation by, demanding transparency and making companies accountable for what they're telling investors.
Now, I know that, when we're looking at historical examples, our sources kind of point to a gap, before the SEC's formation. So was market manipulation just not a thing back then, or is it just harder to track?
I think it was more a matter of it being harder to track. While our sources don't really go into great depth about those pre-SEC examples, it's logical to assume that without these robust regulations, those kinds of tactics could really thrive, even if, the specific term shill wasn't commonly used, back then in the financial context. But moving into that period just after the SEC was formed and into more modern times, we have some really clear instances.
Okay, well let's hear about those post-SEC examples then.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, one classic case, kind of taking place in the 90s and early 2000s is Jordan Belfort and his firm, Stratton Oakmont. I think most people probably know him from the Wolf of Wall Street. Those pump and dump schemes that they were running relied heavily on brokers acting as shills. They were aggressively pushing penny stocks to unsuspecting investors, artificially inflating those prices. And then Belfort and his associates would just sell their own shares for a huge profit. And of course, he was ultimately, convicted in 1999 for securities fraud and money laundering.
That's a great example, and that's the classic. I mean, that's the classic example. When you think of pump and dump schemes and market manipulation,
Yeah,
it's like it's the textbook example.
absolutely.
So what about more recent examples, like especially as we've moved into the age of the internet?
Right.
Yeah, and I mean, sadly, I think the internet have given all sorts of new opportunities for these kinds of manipulations.
Yeah.
There was a really interesting case back in 2000 with this guy Jonathan Libet. He was actually only 15 years old at the time.
Hmm.
He was using online message boards to basically hype up these penny stocks that he had invested in, and he made a lot of money doing it before the SEC caught up with him. And eventually he settled with them for $285,000. For market manipulation.
15 years old. I mean, that's pretty incredible to think that a teenager could be out there influencing the market like that. It is. It really shows you, even individuals can have a real impact, especially with how these online platforms can just amplify messages so quickly. And then you look, as social media has really taken off, in the past decade or so. We've seen even larger schemes playing out, on these platforms. In 2022, the SEC actually charged 8 social media influencers with running a $100 million pump and dump scheme. And they were using platforms like Twitter and Discord, to basically promote certain stocks to their large following. And then secretly, they were selling off their own shares once that price had been artificially pumped up, by all their followers buying in.
Wow, $100 million. I mean, that's a massive scale.
It is. It really is. And it just shows you the power of influence in the digital age and how easily it can be, exploited for financial gain. We also had the BitConnect Ponzi scheme back in 2016 to 2018. While technically that was a Ponzi scheme, the promoters used a lot of tactics that were very, very similar to shilling, to lure investors in, creating these fake testimonials and just generating all this excitement around their cryptocurrency token, promising these huge returns that were just completely unrealistic.
Yeah, and again, exploiting that fear of missing out.
Exactly. And, of course, the SEC ended up bringing charges. One of the main promoters ended up serving a prison sentence. And even more recently, there's this ongoing lawsuit against Elon Musk from 2023, where he's being accused of manipulating the price of Dogecoin through his tweets.
So it seems like, the methods might change, from boiler rooms to online forums to social media to even, celebrity endorsements.
Yeah.
But it's really the underlying principle is the same, right?
It is.
It's about creating that artificial hype.
Exactly. And, even just thinking back, back in 2006, Jim Cramer, he came out and he admitted, how hedge funds will often use, these media shills to their advantage. They might leak positive information or something like that.
Try to get the media to report favorably on certain stocks.
Exactly. And, while he wasn't accused of any wrongdoing himself, it just kind of shows you how these lines can get blurry sometimes, right? And how that media landscape can be used to subtly influence market sentiment.
Yeah, it's a fascinating world. So let's dive into some of the specifics here. Like what are some of the go-to tactics that these shills will use?
Yeah. So, we've already talked about some of the core tactics, right?
Mm-hmm.
Creating this false impression of independent enthusiasm, providing information that seems really positive, but without revealing that, they have some kind of vested interest. And then you also have these cases where, they're spreading information that's just completely false, or it's misleading in some significant way, to really create those artificial price movements, or just to create that sense of urgency, like you need to buy the stock now, before you miss out.
Before it's too late. Yeah.
Exactly. And one of the big tells here, one of the things that you can look for, is that lack of disclosed conflicts of interest. I mean, almost always these shills, they have some sort of financial stake in what they're promoting. They usually own shares that they plan on selling, as soon as the price goes up. So they're basically talking their own book, but they're not telling you that they're doing that.
Right. It's almost like they're kind of like gambling on a horse race, and they've got their money on one of the horses, but they're not telling you that. They're just saying, "Oh, this horse is going to win. You should definitely bet on this horse."
Exactly. And you often see these schemes where a group of individuals will kind of coordinate their efforts. This is the classic pump and dump, where they, get together, they spread positive news, a lot of it fabricated, a lot of it just made up, encouraging others to buy. And then as more people buy in, of course, the price starts to rise, and then that original group just dumps all their shares at this, inflated price. And everybody who came in later, after them, they end up losing money when the hype fades and that stock price inevitably crashes.
It's a classic, it's a classic tactic. And one thing I'm curious about as we're kind of getting into more of the modern examples is how they're using technology. I mean, it seems like things like bots and fake social media accounts, that's got to be a huge factor now, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. With bots, you can create this illusion that there's all this organic, grassroots interest in an asset, when in reality, it's just a few people kind of coordinating their efforts, behind the scenes, and then they can use these fake social media accounts to kind of amplify that message, and make it seem like everybody's talking about this, everybody's buying it, you don't want to be left behind. And it can be very effective. And I think it's interesting too when we look at the energy sector specifically. Our sources point to some interesting tactics being used there. I mean, maybe not as directly related to pumping up a specific stock, but still very much trying to influence the broader conversation around energy and investment.
Yeah, let's talk about that because I think that's a really interesting application of this concept of shilling, right?
Yeah.
So what are some of the tactics that we're seeing being used in the energy industry?
Yeah, so our sources highlight a few recurring themes from those who are really pushing for nuclear energy. One of the tactics is framing nuclear power as the only truly viable clean energy option, and then kind of downplaying the potential of renewables, like solar and wind. Sometimes even using cherry picked data or misrepresenting the capabilities of renewables. Another tactic that's mentioned is kind of overhyping the potential of what are called small modular reactors, SMRs, but without really acknowledging the significant technological, economic, and regulatory hurdles that still exist, for those technologies. And then there's also this spread of misinformation, regarding grid reliability.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, we can't rely on solar and wind. It's too intermittent. It's not reliable enough. We need nuclear. Exactly.
Yeah.
Claiming that only nuclear can provide that consistent baseload power that we need to keep the lights on, and often kind of ignoring advancements that have been made in things like energy storage and grid management, that can make renewables a much more reliable source of power. So, I mean, in a lot of ways, it's less about directly pumping up the stock price of a specific energy company, and it's more about trying to influence this broader conversation around energy policy, and energy investment. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you can kind of shift public perception and kind of influence government regulations,
Yeah.
then that's going to have a trickle down effect, right? It's going to benefit certain players in the energy market.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it's all about shaping that public opinion and influencing those decisions that are being made, that are ultimately going to affect the energy market.
So let's talk about one of the big challenges when it comes to catching these shills and these manipulators. I mean, it seems like the anonymity that the internet affords is a huge factor here. How does that help them? How does hiding their identity, make it easier to get away with these tactics?
Well, I mean, anonymity acts as a shield, right? It conceals their identity, and it makes it really, really difficult for regulators or even for victims of these schemes to trace the activity back to the person who's responsible. Our sources mention a few interesting examples, things like anonymous postings on online forums.
Like Reddit, for example.
Yeah. Exactly. Where you can make these stock recommendations or you can spread misinformation, but you don't have to attach your name to it. And then in the world of cryptocurrencies and NFTs, the use of these anonymous cryptocurrency wallets that can allow people to artificially inflate the value of these digital assets, without ever revealing who they are or how much they're actually involved.
So it's like they're operating in the shadows. It's
Yeah.
very, very difficult to actually trace back. who's pulling the strings.
Exactly, exactly. And the anonymity can also be used to kind of exploit, legal boundaries as well. Someone might argue that, what they're doing is protected free speech. They're just expressing an opinion,
Yeah.
and that might be harder to refute if they're posting anonymously, versus using their real name and identity.
Right. And we should say too, like it's not always just individuals.
Right.
Sometimes this is organized.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
There are groups.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I mentioned pump and dump schemes earlier, right?
Yeah.
Like that's a classic example where you have a group of people coordinating their buying and selling to manipulate a stock price. And anonymity makes that even easier, right? Because it creates this illusion that there's this widespread organic interest when in reality it's just a few people pulling the strings.
So in those cases, it can also be really difficult to prove any kind of manipulative intent.
Exactly. I mean, you have to be able to show that they were intentionally doing this, not just expressing an opinion, and that can be very, very tricky, when you're dealing with anonymous actors.
Now, and it's not just people posting on forums or using fake social media accounts, right? Technology itself is playing a role. Absolutely, absolutely. Things like the blockchain technology that underpins a lot of cryptocurrencies, that offers a degree of anonymity. And then, you also have the rise of AI-powered bots, that can be used to spread these anonymous messages.
Amplify them, yeah.
Amplify them. And it can be, it can really be incredibly difficult to combat.
So all of this kind of leads to this interesting question about the role of platforms like YouTube, for example.
Right.
Where a lot of this financial discussion is now taking place. I mean, if these platforms are hosting content from people who turn out to be shills, could the platforms themselves face some kind of legal trouble?
Yeah, I mean that's a really important question, and it's something that's still evolving legally. While anonymity might shield the individual to some extent, it doesn't necessarily protect the platforms, that are giving them that audience.
Right, they're providing them with the platform.
Exactly, and they're potentially profiting from that activity, and U.S. securities law actually addresses this. Section 12A2 of the Securities Act and the anti-fraud provisions under Rule 10b-5 of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. Those can apply to anyone who's soliciting investments through materially misleading statements.
So even if the platform isn't the one directly making the false statements, if they're hosting it, if they're allowing it to happen on their platform, they're potentially benefiting from it. They could still get in trouble.
Yeah, that's definitely the way that the legal interpretation is moving, I think. There was a case, Pina B. Cardone Capital, that really addressed this issue of social media promotions, and the court actually found that these widespread online endorsements can be considered solicitations for investment. So if a YouTube channel, for example, is actively participating in a fraudulent scheme, let's say they're knowingly promoting content from anonymous shills as part of a coordinated pump and dump, they could face legal action as a co-conspirator.
Right. So they're not necessarily off the hook.
Yeah.
Just because they're a platform.
Exactly.
They have some responsibility, to know what's being said on their platforms.
Yeah, they do. And while they're not expected to vet every single piece of content, they're not the content police. Right. If they become aware that there's demonstrably false or misleading information being used to solicit investments, especially if they're also benefiting financially from the increased traffic and engagement, that kind of hyped content can bring. They could face some scrutiny. They need to be mindful of their own policies around transparency and disclosure, and they need to be taking steps to enforce those.
So what kind of things can they do to protect themselves and their users?
Well, I think the key here is transparency, right? It's encouraging disclosure. So channels should have really clear policies requiring content creators to disclose any conflicts of interest. Do they own the securities that they're talking about?
Right. Are they just pumping up their own their own investments.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Platforms themselves should avoid making, really specific stock price predictions. And they should be using disclaimers, very clear disclaimers stating that the content is for informational or entertainment purposes only. This is not financial advice. And they should also have mechanisms for users to, report content that they think is, potentially misleading or fraudulent. And then when those issues are brought to their attention, they need to take action.
So, kind of coming full circle here, we were talking earlier about some of the shill-like tactics that are being used in the energy sector. I mean, has there been any legal pushback on this kind of activity?
So while the SEC has taken action against energy companies, for things like greenwashing, making misleading claims about their environmental impact, our sources don't really point to any specific cases where the SEC has directly gone after, these broader disinformation campaigns about, different energy sources as a form of market manipulation.
So, like, even if it's not directly about pumping up a specific stock price, if they're engaging in this kind of broader manipulation of the conversation,
Yeah.
that could still potentially be illegal.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the principles of securities fraud and market manipulation, they apply across sectors, right? So if someone is, using misleading information to try and, inflate the price of an energy company's stock, without disclosing that they have, a financial interest in that company, that's likely going to draw the attention of regulators. And we do see, examples, like there was a complaint filed against Shell in 2023. They were accused of overstating their investments in renewables.
And then that's misleading, right?
Right, right. I mean, it's a way of trying to influence, investor decisions, and we
Yeah.
can't forget about things like the First Energy Ohio nuclear bailout scandal, which that involved a lot of lobbying, potentially misleading information to try and influence, legislation.
Right.
So I mean, it's happening. It's definitely happening.
Okay. So, I mean, I think we've covered a lot of ground here today. I want to kind of take a minute to just recap, some of the key takeaways for our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. So we started by defining what a shill is, in the financial context, someone who's secretly promoting a security to create that artificial enthusiasm, often with a hidden financial motive. We talked about the Securities Act of 1933 and how important that was, in making market manipulation illegal. We looked at some, really fascinating historical examples, of shills and how these tactics have evolved, from the pre-internet era to the age of social media.
Right. And then we talked about, how anonymity can protect these shills, and also the potential legal issues, for platforms that host this kind of activity. And then really kind of zooming in on the energy sector and seeing how these same, shill-like tactics can be used to shape the conversation, about energy policy and development.
Exactly.
So, a lot to unpack here.
Hi, this is Jake James Vogel, editor of XGen Investor, and I think our hosts are correct here. There is a lot to unpack related to shills in various industries and in our society in general. And this is part one, where I just kind of define what a shill is and kind of tell you what I'm seeing in the energy sector. Part two is going to be a little more in depth. I'm actually looking into an entity that I believe is a shill in the energy sector, and I'm going to be exposing them for their misinformation and the platforms that allow them to continuously spread their misinformation. So stay tuned.